June 17th, 1944. M4A2 a.m. Northern Saipan, the Coral Rise locals called Hill 450. A thin gray dawn pushed over the shattered ridgeline as Staff Sergeant Daniel H. Mercer, age 26, 2nd Platoon, Company C, 6th Tank Battalion, squinted through the smeared glass of his M4A2 Sherman's periscope. Sweat trickled down the inside of his leather helmet despite the early hour. The Pacific humidity didn't care what time it was. The turret smelled of hot oil, cordite residue, and the sour edge of men who'd barely slept. Outside, the world thumped with mortars. Mercer lowered his face closer to the eyepiece. Elevation 2 degrees. Target, bunker aperture, 12 o'clock, 60 yards. He didn't have to tell his crew what was at stake. They all knew. 2 Shermans from their platoon had been knocked out here yesterday. One by a Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun dug into the cliff face. The other by a pair of satchel charges flung from concealed spider holes. Both losses were still fresh in the men's minds. And much worse, 20 yards in front of Mercer's tank lay the burned husk of a 3rd Sherman, C-23 Wabash Bell. The one the Germans had supposedly mocked in their intelligence bulletins. A Japanese spotter had triggered a perfectly timed mine belt that sheared off the track and held her in place long enough for a field gun to deliver the killing shot. Her turret was pitched at a sick angle, like a beheaded animal frozen mid-collapse. Mercer had been close with her driver. That memory made him tighten his jaw as he watched the ridge through the periscope. The Japanese were out there. Quiet, patient, invisible, and waiting. Behind Mercer, his gunner, Corporal Leo Fisk, shifted restlessly. "Still think this is the mechanically weak American tank, Sarge?" Mercer didn't answer. He didn't have to. The words weren't Leo's. They were copied straight from a captured German liaison report found on a dead officer near Garapan. The American M4 Sherman lacks sufficient armor and presents a high silhouette. Its gasoline engine is prone to fire. Japanese anti-tank units should find it vulnerable. Mercer thought about that line every time he looked through the sight. He wondered what those German observers would think now, seeing the wreckage in front of them, seeing how accurate the Japanese gunners had become. Through the narrow periscope slit, Mercer caught a flicker, then stillness. A glint? A trick of the dawn light? Or the faintest shift of metal inside that bunker slit ahead? His heartbeat kicked. "Gunner, stand by. Loader, he shell." Private Rourke slammed a high explosive round into the breech with a metallic chunk that vibrated in Mercer's ribcage. Mercer clenched the turret handles. "On my mark." But the mark never came. A Japanese machine gun burst ripped across the hull from Mercer's 9 o'clock, sparks bouncing like angry fireflies. The Sherman's armor rang with metallic shock, the sound stabbing through the interior, like someone smashing a railroad spike against a boiler. "Secondary gun, left side," Mercer shouted. Private Dalton, the bow gunner, swiveled his .30 caliber, the interior filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder as he fired blind through the vision port, stitching the ridge where the tracers had come from. Outside, the rising sun finally crested the eastern tree line, and with it, Mercer saw the real problem. Movement, multiple silhouettes, a coordinated counterattack. Japanese infantry, at least a platoon, were crawling up the coral shelves toward their position, using the burned husk of Wabash Bell as cover. Satchel charges, long poles with mines wired to the ends, knee mortars, a tank-killing team. Mercer felt a cold weight drop into his stomach. They'd been waiting for the perfect moment, just like yesterday. And the terrain funneled the Sherman into a single predictable approach. A kill box. "Driver, reverse 10 feet, pivot right," the transmission growled. The hull shuddered. The Sherman backed up over crushed coral, treads clanking like teeth grinding against bone. But Mercer knew something the Germans never wrote in their reports. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a system, a mobile command post, a support weapon, and when used right, the anchor of a combined arms assault. Its armor might not be thick, but its reliability, turret speed, and stabilized 75 mm gun made it deadly at close range, if they lived long enough to use it. The enemy infantry were closing fast now, darting between rocks. Dalton fired another burst. "Gunner, switch to canister," Mercer ordered. "You kidding? At this distance?" Fisk asked. "That's exactly why." Rourke rammed a canister round into the breech, sweat dripping off his chin. The loader's hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline burning through hours of exhaustion. Mercer braced himself. Fisk exhaled, adjusted, squeezed the trigger. The 75 mm roared. Canister shot, essentially a giant shotgun blast, ripped across the coral slope, turning the air white with pulverized rock as hundreds of steel balls tore through the approaching infantry. Through the periscope, Mercer saw bodies pitch backward. Others dove flat. Even the smoke seemed to jerk from the shockwave. But the bunker ahead was still intact. The 47 mm gun was still silent, watching, waiting for them to expose their flank. And Mercer knew they couldn't stay here. Not pinned, not with more infantry crawling in. He leaned closer to the sight. The bunker aperture suddenly darkened, just a fraction, a shadow sliding into view. The Japanese gun was traversing. If that 47 mm fired before they moved, the Sherman would die exactly like Wabash Bell. Mercer's hand tightened on the traverse controls. He had one shot, one precious second, to decide. Would the machine the Germans mocked save them, or burn with them? The shadow inside the bunker slit lingered like a held breath, then vanished. Mercer used that heartbeat of silence to act. "Driver, forward 5, pivot left. Gunner, he loaded on my command." The Sherman lurched ahead, crushing loose coral under its tracks as it angled toward a shallow defilade formed by a jagged lava outcrop. It wasn't cover, just a dip in terrain. But on Saipan, even a 10-inch shift in silhouette could mean the difference between a glancing hit and a turret-piercing shot. As the tank rocked into position, Mercer's thoughts unspooled backward, dragged there by the pressure clenching inside his chest. The Japanese had pinned them here deliberately. How? Why? And how had the Sherman, mocked by officers and foreign observers alike, become the center of this desperate push? To understand this moment, you have to roll back the clock. Back before Mercer ever saw Saipan. Back before the ridgeline became a graveyard of burned-out hulls. 8 months earlier, Camp Pendleton, California, Mercer had not asked to become a tanker. He was a farm boy from Wisconsin who knew more about tractors than armored warfare, and his original assignment was as a mechanic. But in November 1943, when the 6th Tank Battalion began selecting men for a new crop of crews, they picked men who could fix engines under stress, improvise repairs in mud, and understand machinery by sound alone. That was Mercer. He remembered the first time he'd seen the Sherman up close, an M4A2 with a twin GM 671 diesel power plant, its angular hull shimmering under depot lights. The instructors had circled it like skeptical veterinarians. 33 tons, front armor 2 inches thick, 75 mm gun. And yes, the Germans laugh at it, the master sergeant had said. Too tall, they say, too thin, too hot running, too prone to brew up. Some recruits snickered, but Mercer, hands resting on the glass's plate, felt something different. This wasn't a toy. It was an engine of war built to move, not to sit like a bunker on tracks, not to duel Panthers at 2,000 yards. The Sherman was made for Pacific terrain: jungle, mud, coral, ridges, rice paddies, places where reliability meant everything. And the instructors hammered that point. A tank that moves is a tank that lives. A tank that stops is a tomb. But even as they trained, news trickled in from the Pacific: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok. Japanese anti-tank teams had chewed up marine armor, mines, satchel charges, 47mm guns that, on paper, shouldn't have been able to kill a Sherman, and yet did, again and again. The lesson was brutal and simple. The Japanese weren't playing by European rules. Saipan. Everything the instructors warned about. And worse. When Mercer's battalion landed on Saipan in June 1944, the island erupted beneath them. Japanese defenders used a network of caves, ridges, and pillboxes tied together by nearly invisible crawl tunnels. Normal doctrine collapsed. Infantry begged for tank support. Tanks begged for infantry cover, and both suffered catastrophic losses whenever they separated even a few yards. What the Germans didn't understand, and what early American commanders hadn't respected, was that the Japanese defenders didn't think of anti-tank combat as gun versus tank. They saw it as opportunity versus enemy breathing. Any gap, any blind spot, any distraction meant a tank died. Shermans burned. Men died trying to escape the hatches, and the battalion began losing confidence. Mercer's platoon had been hit hardest. 3 tanks disabled in 48 hours. 12 men dead, 1 missing. The cratered slope at Hill 450, where Mercer now fought, was the same place where Wabash Bell had been immobilized. The Germans called it inferior design. Mercer called it terrain the textbooks didn't show. Yet something unexpected happened amidst this carnage. The Sherman began to show its teeth. On Saipan's coral, the Sherman's much-mocked suspension, its vertical volute spring system, handled the brutal terrain better than any pre-war planner could have predicted. While Japanese Type 95 tanks buckled under heavy recoil or snapped track pins on coral shelves, the Sherman bounced, absorbed, and kept going. Its 75mm gun, dismissed by German officers as outdated, proved devastating at close range against bunkers and rocky fortifications. High explosive rounds shattered apertures. Canister rounds crushed banzai charges. Shermans could fire faster, traverse faster, recover faster, and they almost never overheated. By day 4 of the Saipan campaign, infantry commanders were requesting Sherman support for every push, even begging to delay assaults until tanks arrived. And whispers spread across the battalion. Maybe this thing the Germans call weak is exactly what we need. The problem: Hill 450. But the Japanese holding Hill 450 had adapted. They studied Sherman movement patterns. They concealed the 47mm gun inside a bunker with multiple false slits. They planted mines not in obvious choke points, but in staggered, irregular rows, aimed to trap tanks into exposing their flanks. Enemy doctrine evolved. They used German-style kill zones, tight, interlocking, deliberate. By the time Mercer reached the base of the slope, the enemy had already killed 2 tanks. They knew where the Shermans would turn their turrets, knew where they would crest, knew exactly where to place the shot. Which meant Mercer, right now, staring at that bunker slit, had to do something none of the earlier crews had dared: break the pattern, do what the manuals didn't allow. Use the Sherman in a way German intelligence officers would have called reckless or illogical, and do it before that 47mm gun finished traversing. Mercer inhaled. "Gunner, get ready. We're taking the fight to them." A beat of silence passed through the interior. The crew exchanged brief looks, fear, confusion, trust. Then Mercer issued the order that would decide whether they lived or died. Driver, full throttle toward the bunker. The Sherman surged forward, straight into the kill zone the Japanese believed they owned. The Sherman lunged forward with a metallic growl, treads grinding coral into powder. Inside the turret, Mercer braced his boots against the floor plates as the tank bucked over uneven ground. Every jolt rattled teeth. Every bounce threatened to throw the 75mm off target. But that was the point. Japanese gunners expected predictability. Shermans creeping, pausing, angling their armor in textbook approaches. Mercer wasn't giving them that. He was turning the Sherman into a charging hammer. The bunker aperture widened in Mercer's periscope as the tank closed the distance. 70 yards, 50, 40. "Gunner, stand by, he ready," Rourke barked. The Japanese 47mm inside the bunker was built for exactly this moment. A stationary American tank hesitating in the open. They had been patient for hours. Now the trap was set. A muzzle flash erupted inside the slit. "Hit incoming," Fisk shouted. The 47mm anti-tank round shrieked across the slope and slammed into the Sherman's right front glosses with a shrill metallic scream. The hull rocked as if punched by a giant fist. Paint vaporized in a cloud of gray-white dust. "Armor held," the driver yelled. Mercer didn't answer. His heartbeat drowned everything out. He snapped the turret controls. "Gun on! On! Fire!" The 75mm barked. The shockwave thudded through Mercer's bones. The HE shells smashed into the bunker slit with explosive force, blowing out coral dust and wooden reinforcements. Smoke belched from the aperture. A scream echoed from inside, quick, high, and then gone. But the Japanese weren't done. Infantry surged from behind the bunker's blind side, grenade bundles, bamboo poles with mines wired on the end. A knee mortar team scrambling to set up. "Dalton, MG right. Cut them down." Dalton's 30 cal chattered. Sparks burst from coral shelves. Japanese troops dove behind rocks, crawling low, refusing to break. But Mercer saw something else. Two shapes flanking left, satchel charges in hand, closing the last 30 yards. They used the terrain like ghosts, slipping between shadows. "Driver, pivot! Pivot now!" The Sherman spun, treads biting into the coral. The satchel charge men darted forward. Fisk fired the coax. A burst tore one man off his feet. The second kept running. "Loader, canister!" Rourke shoved the canister round home. "Loaded! Fire!" The 75mm discharged again. This time the blast scattered coral like snow, shredding the attacker before he could reach the hull. But the cost was immediate and brutal. "Gunner, we're low on hay," Rourke yelled from the loader's station. He held up 2 remaining shells. Sweat streaked his face. "We burn these. We're on AP and canister only." "That's enough," Mercer said, though he didn't believe it fully. The slope trembled under another impact. The Japanese bunker had a second 47mm gun. It fired. The round struck the Sherman's left side near the sprocket, a deafening clang that shook every rib in Mercer's body. Warning lights blinked on the driver's panel. "Track still on. Armor held." The driver shouted again, though the panic in his voice betrayed the uncertainty. Mercer steadied himself. They couldn't sit here trading blows. The enemy had the advantage of fixed positions and interlocking guns. The only way out was through. He rotated the turret toward the second bunker, following the faint outline cut into the coral shelf. Its aperture was tiny, barely large enough to spot. Exactly the kind of position that would kill a paused tank. "Driver, advance. Gunner, neck slit left. 30 yards." The Sherman rocketed forward again. The crew was slammed against their harnesses. Dust sifted from every seam in the turret roof. Fisk tracked the target through the jostling sight. Almost. A mortar round landed 10 feet short, showering the hull in fragments. Fire! The 75mm fired a third time. The HE round punched straight into the bunker's slit. The explosion blew the right side of the structure outward in a plume of pulverized coral and dark smoke. Bodies spilled out of the rear crawl tunnel. The Japanese counterattack faltered. For the first time in hours, the ridge went still. But Mercer didn't trust stillness. On Saipan, silence meant ambush, not safety. He was right. A flanking team, 5 men, burst from the collapsed bunker's side, racing uphill toward a rocky overhang. A knee mortar hung from one man's shoulder. Another carried a heavy mine pole. If they reached that overhang, they'd be above the Sherman. A single drop, a single mine, and the tank would burn like Wabash Bell. Mercer snapped orders. Driver, full left, cut them off. The Sherman lurched toward the flank. The Japanese sprinted harder, sand kicking up behind their heels. Gunner, canister. Loaded. Ready. Mercer saw the moment. The exact heartbeat where distance, angle, and motion aligned. Fire. The canister round erupted from the barrel like a metal thunderstorm. Steel pellets shredded the rocky ledge and the men climbing toward it. The last survivor tumbled backward, disappearing behind the coral lip. Then, silence. Real silence. Not a trap. Not a pause. But the abrupt, stunned quiet of an enemy suddenly outmatched. Mercer exhaled for the first time in minutes. The numbers had flipped. For the first time on Hill 450, the Sherman wasn't prey. It was the hunter. Behind them, infantry who had kept low for half an hour finally rose and surged forward, emboldened. And for the first time, the Japanese defenders began to fall back. Mercer looked through the periscope, smoke drifting across his field of view. This tank, the one German observers mocked as weak, had just broken the strongest defensive knot on northern Saipan. But the shock waves of this moment were only beginning. The coral dust was still settling when Mercer lifted his face from the periscope. His ears rang. The interior of the Sherman glowed faintly with heat, radiating off the 75mm barrel. Smoke drifted from the loader's hatch, but the crew was alive. And more importantly, the ridge was collapsing in their direction. American infantry, emboldened by the Sherman's violent breakthrough, surged forward in a wave of shouts and clattering gear. For the first time in the battle for Hill 450, they weren't crawling. They were advancing upright, rifles raised, seizing ground the Japanese had held for days. Mercer could see them through the periscope. 2nd Battalion Marines sweeping in behind the tank, using the Sherman as a moving shield as they cleared spider holes and dugouts that had stopped them cold the previous afternoon. What Mercer didn't see, not yet, was the broader fallout already in motion. At the base of the ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Charles B. Richardson, commanding the 6th Tank Battalion, stood over a field map while radio men relayed breathless updates. He listened as the reports spilled in. C-14 advanced past the bunker line. 2 47mm guns neutralized. Infantry requesting immediate tank support to exploit breakthrough. Enemy counterattacks broken. Hill 450 is opening up. Richardson lifted his binoculars and scanned the ridge. Plumes of she smoke still drifted upward from the bunkers Mercer had smashed. Even from a distance, he could see the altered posture of the infantry. No longer pinned, no longer scattered. A junior officer whispered, "Sir, one Sherman did that?" Richardson's jaw tightened. One Sherman used properly. He'd read the same German analysis memos that Mercer's crew had joked about. He'd seen the dismissive comments from technical observers. High silhouette, thin armor, gasoline engine fires, mechanical unreliability. And to be fair, some critiques weren't wrong. Shermans burned if hit just right, and they weren't meant to duel Panthers in open fields. But in the Pacific, against caves, coral, and infantry ambushes, reliability was power. Gun traverse was power, stabilization was power, speed was power. And Mercer had just demonstrated it in textbook clarity. "Get me every detail of that assault," Richardson said. "I want turret rotation times, ammo expenditure, route of advance, and exactly how he approached those bunkers." A staff sergeant blinked. "Sir, the men are still fighting." "Then write as they talk." By Otto 9:15, the last organized resistance on Hill 450 collapsed. Japanese defenders who survived the initial fighting withdrew into deeper caves or fled downhill in scattered groups. Marines raised smoke flags to signal the ridge was secure. And then something happened that Mercer would remember for the rest of his life. An operations officer approached his tank, tapped the Glycis plate, and shouted up to him, "Tank Commander, HQ wants you as soon as your turret is cold." Mercer blinked. "What for?" The officer grinned. "Every division commander on the island is asking the same question. How did one Sherman break a whole defensive line?" Fisk chuckled from inside the turret. "Guess the Germans didn't write that part in their reports." By late afternoon, Richardson's staff had compiled the first formal assessment. One Sherman advanced 178 yards under coordinated anti-tank fire. 2 47mm guns destroyed. 3 satchel-charge teams eliminated. 1 flanking mortar team neutralized. 27 infantry positions suppressed or destroyed. 0 mobility kills on Mercer's tank. 0 crew casualties. For comparison, the previous day's attack, without a maneuvering Sherman, had cost 3 destroyed tanks, 42 infantry casualties, 0 enemy bunkers breached. Those numbers hit like a thunderclap. The battalion intelligence officer said it plainly. "Sir, the mathematics of this ridge changed today." Before noon, Richardson issued new directives. 1. Shermans would spearhead all assaults on fortified terrain. 2. Tanks and infantry would train in tight supporting formations, no more than 15 yards apart. 3. Canister rounds would be staged forward in higher quantities. 4. Tank commanders were encouraged to maneuver aggressively against fixed guns, never halt in expected fire zones. This became known across the battalion as the Saipan method. Within days, other Marine tank units adopted it. Within weeks, Army armored units did too, on neighboring Tinian and Guam. And within months, the doctrine reached all the way to the Pacific Fleet's senior staff. For the first time, the M4 Sherman wasn't seen as a liability to be protected, but as a decisive tool to be unleashed. Captured diaries from Japanese officers revealed their shock. "These tanks move faster than we can adjust our sights. Their guns strike before we can fire again." The same tank killed 2 guns in minutes. "We did not believe the American machine could do this." One lieutenant wrote, "It is like fighting a steel animal that refuses death." The German observers, attached to Japanese units as technical advisors, were even more stunned. Several of their intelligence summaries, later recovered on Guam, included lines like, "The Sherman exceeds expectations in rapid assault." American tank doctrine improved sharply on Saipan. Mobility and turret speed compensate for armor thickness. It wasn't praise, it was alarm. What Mercer did on Hill 450 didn't just change a ridge. It changed how tanks fought in the Pacific. It changed how commanders planned assaults. It changed how infantry requested support. It changed how the enemy feared American armor. But its biggest impact, Mercer would only learn years later, was how it altered the memory of the Sherman as a whole. That story, however, began long after the battle ended, long after the smoke cleared, long after the men scattered back to their lives, and long after anyone thought they'd be remembered. The ridge was quiet by nightfall. Mercer sat on the Sherman's hull, helmet off, canteen in hand, staring at the distant glow of burning positions along the western horizon. The heat of the day still radiated from the tank's steel skin. Machinery clicked softly as it cooled. Rourke and Dalton argued somewhere behind him about who had scored more hits. Fisk was already asleep inside the turret, one arm dangling out like a man dozing on a porch. Mercer didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink for long stretches. Because for the first time in days, maybe weeks, the sounds of Saipan were not punctuated by incoming rounds. The ridge was theirs. But victory in the Pacific never felt clean. It felt temporary, like the sunlight would rise tomorrow and reveal dozens more ridges, more caves, more bunkers, more men determined to die where they stood. Still, for one evening, Mercer allowed himself to feel something close to relief. The next campaign came fast. Too fast. Barely 14 days after Saipan was declared secure, Mercer's unit rolled onto Tinian's White Beach, where they confronted terrain even more hostile. Steep limestone cliffs, sugarcane fields that hid anti-tank traps, and Japanese defenders who had studied Saipan's failures and adapted quickly. But something had changed. Every infantry company commander wanted Sherman support. Every assault plan integrated tanks from the first minute. Every platoon leader cited Hill 450 as the reason to push forward. And Mercer, now recognized by name in battalion briefings, found himself at the center of this shift. Across Tinian, whenever tanks advanced in tight coordination with infantry, the Japanese lines cracked open faster than expected. Bunkers fell. Guns were silenced. Entire sectors collapsed under shock action before defenders could react. The Saipan method had become standard doctrine, and the M4 Sherman, mocked for years, had become the backbone of Pacific assault tactics. During the closing days of the Tinian operation, a war correspondent named Alan McKeever embedded with the 6th Tank Battalion. He spent hours interviewing crews about Hill 450 and the evolving tank infantry tactics. At first, Mercer kept a low profile. He disliked talking about it. But McKeever persisted, claiming the war needed stories of adaptation, not just destruction. One afternoon, the correspondent snapped a photograph of Mercer and his crew standing beside their tank. The backdrop was nothing dramatic. Just a dusty clearing, a pile of discarded track links, and palm fronds trembling in a coastal breeze. McKeever wrote in his notebook, "The tank that German observers dismissed as weak became the tank that broke Saipan." At the time, Mercer didn't think much of it. But that photograph would travel far beyond the Pacific. It would appear in a stateside newspaper feature, then a magazine, then an Army training circular, then, years later, in a museum exhibit on Pacific warfare. The caption stayed simple: "The Men of Hill 450. Mercer mustered out of the service in late 1945. He returned to Wisconsin with a duffel bag, a Bronze Star, and a limp he tried to hide from his parents. He worked as a mechanic, then a farmer, then a municipal equipment supervisor. Quiet jobs, steady jobs. Jobs where small fixes mattered more than drama. He married in 1948, had 2 daughters, bought a house with a white porch, slept lightly for the rest of his life. He almost never spoke about Saipan. When neighbors asked, he'd shrug and say, "We had a good tank and good men." But that wasn't quite true. They didn't have a good tank. They had one that others doubted, one the Germans dismissed, one early commanders underestimated, one the Japanese assumed they could kill with mines and poles. What made the Sherman great on Saipan wasn't just the machine. It was how men like Mercer used it, how they adapted under fire, how they rewrote doctrine in real time because the terrain gave them no choice. The legacy wasn't metal. It was decision-making under pressure. And Mercer was always more proud of that than of any medal in his drawer. In the summer of 1969, a military historian researching Pacific armor doctrine visited Mercer at his home. He brought a battered folder labeled Hill 450, After Action Summary, 6th Tank Battalion. Inside, Mercer found Richardson's handwritten notes about his assault, ammunition charts from Rourke's loader logs, diagrams showing Mercer's unorthodox advance angle, German intelligence assessments shocked by the Sherman's performance, a blurred black and white photograph of the Japanese bunker he destroyed with his first HE round and near the back, the photo McKeever had taken of him and his crew. Mercer sat with it in silence for a long time. The historian asked, "Staff Sergeant, do you believe this engagement changed anything?" Mercer closed the folder gently. It changed the men who were watching, and it changed the enemy who didn't expect us to move like that. Then he added, almost reluctantly, and it proved that tank was better than they said it was. Hill 450 became a case study in mobile assault on fortified positions, tank infantry synchronization, the importance of momentum in close terrain, the utility of canister rounds in Pacific fighting, the decisive advantage of fast turret traverse over sheer armor thickness. In the Korean War, armored officers cited Saipan as justification for maneuver-based assaults in mountainous terrain. During Vietnam, some instructors referenced Pacific tank actions when teaching about jungle operations. Decades later, when the U.S. Army wrote training manuals on rapid assault doctrine, the Saipan method appeared again. Still relevant, still studied, still echoing. All because one Sherman crew refused to die on a ridge. Stories like this survive only if people keep telling them. If you're watching this, you're part of that chain. Part of the effort to keep the memory of men like Mercer and machines like the Sherman alive and understood. So before this video ends, I want to ask you, where are you watching from? Did anyone in your family serve during WW2 or in the Pacific? Drop a comment below so we can honor their stories too. And if you want more long-form WW2 documentaries, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because every time you do, it tells YouTube these stories still matter and helps keep the history alive for the next generation.